Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started. So today we wanted to dive into the topic of localization, or some people call it internationalization, and some people think those are different. I don't really know. I just call it all localization, and that works for me. But more generally, we're talking about the concept of taking your application and making it having its appearance and its strings and the things in it be adaptive based on where in the world your user is and what language they're speaking, and being adaptive in those kinds of ways. And generally, this is kind of one of those things that I feel like it's a lot of times viewed as kind of like a hygiene thing, like in the sense of it's this thing that maybe you think you should do, but often you don't. For a long time, I had none of my applications localized at all. And it was always this thing that I'd go to the session at WWDC and kind of feel bad about myself and say, oh, this year I'll do it. And then I'd go back and I wouldn't actually do it. And I think it's a tricky one because unless you live in a multilingual or international life, where if you speak two languages at home, or you live abroad from where your native language is, or something like that, it's not something that you would necessarily come across in your day-to-day life. And it's always hard, I think, to write features for an application that you yourself won't benefit from in using it. So when I make my app, have display all of its strings in German, that's great, but I don't speak German, so I have no idea if they're right, and which we'll get into a bit later, and B, I don't feel that benefit. And so I have struggled for a long time to do it. And I'll certainly say it's a bit of a pain to do, because if you want to do this, you have to structure a lot of the visual components of your application very differently. You have to make things very flexible. You can't hard code a lot of values. Everything has to be able to be switched in and out and adaptable depending on what language and locale your app is being used. But one day I bit the bullet, and the first app I ever localized was Pedometer++, and I localized it and had a pretty impactful change as a result. I found that my downloads outside of English-speaking countries, so outside of the United States, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Canada with an asterisk because obviously they speak French there too, but they, by and large, outside of those countries, I found that my downloads went up by about 3 times.
Wow.
And overall, that meant that my overall sales didn't go up by 3 times, because most of my sales were still coming from English-speaking countries. But overall, my sales did go up. I think it went up by about more like 50%, which was encouraging. And the effort it took to get there was certainly. It's debatable overall whether it was the right trade-off, but I think in general it taught me the lesson that there is an impact to this, and it is something that we at least all need to consider. Because I've also had the flip side where I've localized some of my other applications and I've had essentially no increase. And so it's not like a silver bullet. It's not like if you localize your app, your sales will go up 3 times. That's definitely not the case. I've had the experience I had in Pedometer++ was by far the best I've had, but it's also it's somewhat distinct from some of my other experiences. Have you ever localized any of your applications?
I mean, basically the answer is no, but I've been I've been near internationalization efforts before in past jobs, and so I kind of know what's involved. And I know I too have gone every year to the WWDC sessions about localization, and I too have sat there feeling bad about myself, thinking, why don't I just do this already? Let's just do it, But it's, as you mentioned, it is not easy to do, and one of the biggest questions in my mind, and which I hear people ask me all the time, is, will this actually increase sales, and by how much? And as you said, a big increase for you in non-English speaking countries, that's great. However, it's hard to know, as you said, it's hard to know whether that will apply to my app or not. And it's hard to know how big that increase will be, and then whether it will be worth the costs. But to me, I kind of see internationalization and localization. I also don't know the difference. I know there is one, and people will get mad at us for not knowing it, but I don't know what it is. I see them, too, as kind of a code hygiene thing, and it's kind of similar to accessibility in some ways, where if you make an interface accessible via the iOS accessibility mechanisms for things like VoiceOver and other assistive technologies, it takes sometimes it takes a little bit more work in the coding and design stage, but it usually isn't that much more work to make it possible and to make it to do it well. Usually it's actually very little work because Apple's stuff is so good. You just kind of have to be aware of it as you're coding. And there are certain aspects of internationalization that are that easy. Things like date formatting and stuff like that, like number formatting, currency formatting. In those kind of areas, Apple provides really easy APIs, date formatters, number, like that kind of stuff, that if you just use them correctly at all, then you will just get nicely formatted things. Your strings won't be automatically translated to different languages, but things like displaying numbers and things like that, that's very easy to get right and to have kind of done for you automatically. In Overcast, I make extensive use of that kind of thing. And for the strings, I do wrap all of my UI strings in NS localized string, which is this macro that you should, look up NS localized string if you don't know what it is. You should be using it. I do that for kind of preparation for potential future internationalization efforts, so that it's easy to see all my UI strings and easy to pull them out and have them automatically translated, or have them translated in an automated kind of way if I ever need that. But I don't actually do that. I haven't actually translated it. So I have a few instances where I'm kind of abusing the formatters. Like in my list of episodes, I omit the year from the date from an episode's release date if it's the current year, because I think that's just a nice little thing to get a little bit less clutter. Like if your episode was released on August 1st and that was 2 weeks ago, I don't need to know that it was 2016, like, because I already know it's 2016. Thank you. And this works. There's no built-in function that I know of to do this very well. So I do kind of a hack, which is I get the localized version of the current year and just remove that substring from the date string. And this turns out to be a really dumb implementation, because in certain countries there's I forget exactly where it was. I think it might have been in a Portuguese-speaking country or a Spanish-speaking country, but there was something where I got an email from a user saying, this is kind of weird looking, because there's a word between the day or the month and the year, the way it's formatted, where it's like of or the, so it's like, July of 2016, whatever the translated version of that is. And so in my version of this, it just says, 16th July of.
That's not great.
No, it's not great. So I have to probably revisit this strategy. But for the most part, everything else has been done only in the ways of like using the built-in formatters for numbers and dates and currencies and things, but not actually translating the strings, but making it easy to do so in the future if I want to.
Yeah, and I think the approach you're taking is certainly the one that is at the very least the right approach. That making as you're building an app, being aware that this might be something you want to do later, I think will certainly increase the likelihood that one day you will actually get to it, rather than hitting the point where it's like, okay, I need to now search in my app for every string that is being displayed and then add the NS localized string macro to it, or I need to now go and switch everything over to using formatters. And so now in iOS 10, I think there's the new units formatters, which are even take this even farther, that you can now, it's not even just dates and currency that you can do in numbers. Now you could, you can even do clever things about speeds or distances. So I run into this with a couple of my workout apps where, it's how far did you run? And right now I do some things where I need to be clever about which unit to use and have options in the application for switching that. On first launch, I'll see what country you're in, and I assume that if you're not in the United States, you're probably going to use metric units, which in general I think is pretty much the case. And so I do those switches manually. In the iOS 10, I can do this automatically, but by and large, it seems like in general a good idea to keep this as something that it's part of building an app properly. And just like you were saying with accessibility, if you build an app to do this, it's probably ultimately also going to be a better app, because you're being thoughtful about what you're displaying to your user at a different level. Sometimes I run into situations where I'm just being lazy, and so I'll add some words of explanation for something and in that case, it's probably symptomatic of my app actually being too confusing and not obvious enough about how to operate it if I have to sort of build instructions into it. And if you're in a localization mindset, there's a cost to adding that string, because now that gets added to your list of things that you need to translate and have localized. And so it's, in some ways, it helps you think about your application in a constructive way to make sure that, it's like, if you couldn't read anything in this application, could you still use it? And if you can, that's probably a good indication that even if you can read the strings and the labels and things in your application, it's still going to be a good experience. But by and large, it's a funny thing, because I think localizing just to have more downloads is, I think, a good reason. And I think in general, for most people, there is going to be it's very unlikely that you're going to have a negative correlation there. It would only be if you had a terrible translation and the app was actually worse after localizing it. But generally speaking, I think, having something that's more relevant to a customer by nature should increase that somewhat. But the other reason that I think is good to keep in mind when you're thinking about whether you should or shouldn't localize your application is, in general, I think Apple tends to only feature applications that are localized in the country's app store that they're doing the feature in. And so if you want to be featured in the Japanese app store, in the German app store, in the French app store, in the Spanish app store, you probably need to be localized into that country. And probably at the very least have your screenshots and app store description localized, and probably even your app as well. And that certainly is, again, it's just one of these opportunities that, in as cutthroat of a market as the App Store is, those little edges, those little things that, in general, localization isn't a mountain of work. It's something that you have to work on, and it'll lose you, a day out of a point release kind of work. It's hard to put your finger on exactly the impact that it's having, but I think it'll have an impact. And the reality is that it's a little advantage that you may as well take, that it's something you can do directly. And it's not like you have to think of this grand new, innovative vision for something where you've come up with something totally new. It's like you're just doing the basics better. And maybe if your competitors aren't localized, then you'll have that little edge on them. And especially, I think a lot of App Store algorithms, as best I can tell, have this built-in sense of, as you get a little bit better, there's a stronger benefit to the person in front, which is problematic in some ways, but in this case can be beneficial. That if you can do lots of little things to be slightly better than your competitor, you're showing up higher in charts, you're more likely to be featured, you may show up higher in search. There's all these little things that can add up, and this is just one of them. And so in general, I'd say you should localize your app. And I mean, I was actually looking at Overcast before we were recording, and it's a funny app because I think most of the app you could localize very easily. Because most of it is it's content that's relevant to the user already. It's like it's self-localizing. If I'm in France listening to French podcasts, you don't have to translate the title of the podcasts. All that is already there. It's just the surrounding infrastructure around it. And, even the names of the name of the playlist, they're going to name the playlist whatever they want to name it. It's not like you have to do something clever there. It's just some other labels. And so it's probably something worth doing.
Yeah, I mean, it also, beyond selfish reasons of this will get more downloads, which are very important. Beyond that, though, a lot of people, if you don't localize, and I know this from the experience of having apps that I haven't localized, if you don't localize, a lot of people who don't speak your language will still use the app anyway. They'll just fumble through. They'll just, because a lot of times there might not be any other apps to do the thing, or they might have heard about yours and yours might be the best one, or they just might want to try yours, or whatever the reason. A lot of people who don't speak the language of your app will try to use it regardless. And so it's really a design question of do you want the experience of using your app to be better for people who don't speak the language that it's in? Do you want them to be able to use it? Do you want to be able to provide value to people who don't speak your language? And to some degree, as you said, if you look at Overcast, I've taken a lot of this to heart where I try to basically avoid a lot of text where possible. But just avoiding the need for text and translation will get you a lot of the way there, and will let people try to kind of figure out and fumble through more easily. I see even like with games, like my 4-year-old son can't read yet, but he knows how to play a lot of games on his iPad because they don't rely so much on text. They just have buttons and icons and things, and he's able to figure those out. The more your app can not rely on text, the better. But for the text that it does rely on, you're doing a great service to the design and experience of a lot of real world users by localizing, because people who don't speak your language are going to try to use it anyway. But anyway, in the case of Overcast, though, I am also a little bit scared of a number of issues that we'll probably get to in the second half of the show. But little things like what you mentioned, the UI design, like there are so many features and labels in the interface where like I've chosen the words extremely carefully, and like I will choose the name of a feature based on what will fit in the table view cell in the settings screen. I will often like make decisions about like exactly what words this has to be based on like what will fit. And I know that if I localize everything, it will add a lot of overhead to a lot of the testing and the validation of the UI and everything on different size devices, especially. And some of that we can automate, some of it we can't. But also, it'll be very easy for my app to be misunderstood. But I guess this is kind of the perfect being the enemy of the good. Like right now, my app is being understood even worse by people who don't speak my language. So I guess maybe that's just a cost I'd have to bear. Yeah, well, before we continue on that front, we are brought to you this week by CocoConf. Now, this upcoming March 20th through 23rd, CocoConf is returning to Yosemite National Park for its third Yosemite event. And let me tell you, people, I have heard so many great things about this. I'm gonna try to go this year, I think, because I've heard so many great things about it, and I keep having scheduling problems and I can't go. But I wish I can go to this event. I think I'm gonna try to make it work this year. We'll see. Anyway, this event, March 20th through 23rd, held again at the Yosemite Lodge at the Falls in Yosemite National Park. Speakers include Ashley Nelson Hornstein, friend of the show, David Smith, Andy Anako, Matt Drance, Jamie Newberry, Brent Simmons, and Daniel Steinberg. Sessions run in the mornings and evenings, and afternoons are spent exploring Yosemite National Park, with activities including ranger-led hikes, a bus tour of the valley, a photo walk by TED photographer James Duncan Davidson. These are all great options for you to choose if you want to. There's also music by James Dempsey and the Breakpoints, and by Jonathan Song a Day Man. And you can use code UNDERTHERADAR to save 20% on your tickets to Yosemite. So head on over to cococonf.com/Yosemite to register. David, you'll be there, obviously, because you're speaking. I really hope to be there. Looks to be a great conference. And thanks a lot to CocoConf for sponsoring our show once again.
So to pick back up what you were talking about, I think there is a fundamental thing, and we'll think for the rest of the show, we'll kind of dive into a bit of the mechanics of what localization is, that once you finally decide it's something that you're going to do, I think you kind of have to let go a little bit on perfection in order to approach this, because just fundamentally the width of words in languages is just mind-bendingly different between languages. You'll have the classic example is something like German, which tends to have these very long words for relatively simple concepts. And then you go all the way to some of the Asian languages, where you'll have a single one-character symbol as the equivalent of what's being said there. And so you'll never have, I know what the feeling of what you're talking about, where you want to have just that perfectly, that perfect word that makes everything line up nicely, or it gives you a good, sort of balance to the screen. And when you're localizing, you just at a certain point have to say, it's going to be impossible. And I'd rather, it's I think like you just said, I'd rather it be understandable than visually perfect. And maybe there's a way that if you were really a linguistic genius, that you could find different words, that are more appropriate or might convey the same meaning but have a more similar length. Maybe that's possible. But I think I've just had to accept that going down this road is probably better, because not doing it, it's like having something that looks visually slightly less balanced perhaps, is going to be better than something that looks balanced but is unintelligible.
Yeah.
So when you're localizing something, I think briefly to just say there's two things that you're sort of typically doing. You're localizing the language. So I'm an English speaker. That's the only language that I really can speak with any fluency, and so I write my applications in English as a result, and I can take that language, all of the English words, and translate them into another language. And then there's the more cultural differences, and this can both be things like we were saying with units, so metric versus imperial units, or date formats, or even getting into differences within a language. So, for example, we spell the word color differently in the United States than they do in Great Britain. And so you can get into those kind of cultural differences.
Yeah, but we're right.
Of course we are. You don't need that U. That U is completely unnecessary. And that's the way it is. UI color doesn't have a U in it. So when I'm working on iOS,
UI color.
UI color. So you can do, there's those two different things that you can be localizing in. And in general, the more cultural ones are a lot of the things that you're probably going to want to lean on Apple for their date formatters and unit formatters and number formatters. And the language ones is probably what I'll talk mostly about now, because that's when most people think of localization. I think that's what we think of. And that's taking all of the strings that are displayed in your application and wrapping them up in NS localized string macros. And actually, I realized I don't actually know how you do this in Swift, but I'm sure there's something similar to it, but it's probably not called NS localized string, but there's something I'm sure that can translate back and forth. And you run a little script that pulls all those out of your application, and you end up with this little configuration file that's basically just a string and then a translation. And you can take that file and send it to a translation service. There's many of these. I've used a bunch of them. In general, I'm sure there maybe are some differences, but by and large, I've used a couple and they've all been about the same. It's at this point in iOS development, I think the tools are mature enough that any of these and I think Apple even has a website where they recommend a bunch of them. You just take your strings file, you send it to them, and they'll have a translator translate it back. One thing you want to do there is, in NS localized string, you give both the string you want to translate and you can have a little comments field. And it's very strongly recommended that you put something useful in that comments field, not just the same string again or leaving it blank. Because you want to give the translator a sense of what the string actually means in context. I know some translation services also even request that you send screenshots of your application to the translator so they can see what it looks like in context. And so they're going to translate it and send it back to you. Or something you can also do is ask a friend or a colleague. I've started actually doing this a few times, especially when I'm doing small translation batches. I'll just ask on Twitter, hey, I'll make a little Google form and say, hey, here's this one string that I need up, for a point release. If you speak any of the languages that my app's translated in, which I think right now is German, Spanish, French, Russian, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, I think are the ones that I use typically, maybe Portuguese. If you speak any of those languages, translate it. Obviously that's nice for me because I have a large enough audience that I can find someone who speaks one of those languages, but otherwise just use a translation service and it's the same.
I will say, generally what you want is somebody who is native to the target language, but fluent in yours, not vice versa. So if you come up with somebody who grew up speaking English, but learned a bit of French in high school, that's ideally you want a French person to do the translation for you instead, who just knows enough English to understand what you're trying to say. It could, because a native speaker, there's a lot of differences and nuance to these languages, to any language, and ideally you want a native speaker.
Yes, and I think even I've run into this a few times with translation services, where in an ideal way, and this is why I've actually started leaning more on asking friends and people I know who speak the languages that I'm translating into, is if someone who actually uses your application on a regular basis will have a better translation, because I've definitely had a thing where they say the word you're using here is the right word. It's not like they messed up the translation, but the way in which they're using it is different than what a typical person would expect it to be said as. You can, I will raise my hand and confess that I have used Google Translate a few times.
Oh, don't do that.
when I was trying to rush out an update and I didn't, usually this is the problem with localization is once you do it, you kind of have to keep doing it. If you make a small change that adds a string or changes a string, it's like, oh, I don't want to have to go through a translation service or go through a big process. So I always just go to Google Translate and did a few translations, and it's a train wreck. Like I've done it and I've lived to tell the tale, but I would not recommend it. It is definitely not something, because you'll get some very strange customer support emails where they're just like, so I don't know how to say this best, but the person who did your translation didn't really translate it so much as turned it into unintelligible gibberish. And so avoid that. Like if you're just wanting to have a placeholder there, a much better placeholder is in Xcode. You can launch your application with a pseudo language, which is designed to test your layout. And so things are really long and have to use different character sets and things. Like if you want to just have something there to validate your layout with, use that. Don't use Google Translate. I made a mistake. But then, yeah, you just go through that. You end up with the strings back. You put them back into your application. And now your application, when you launch it, will be in the new language. And it's kind of cool the first time you launch your application and you don't understand any of the text. It's kind of a strange feeling, but it's kind of cool. And then you have an app that is localized. And as you go, as you make changes, you just need to keep track of the differences, the new strings, or if you make changes to strings. And your app's localized. And I don't know if it's anything even more on that process. Like Apple has gotten the tool set to at this point to be pretty good. There was a time, I think earlier, when I looked into localization back in like iOS 3 or 4 days. And it was much more manual and much more cumbersome. But in general now, you just kind of run the few scripts, it pulls it out, you send those off to a translation service, you get them back, you put them back in, and you're kind of, you're up and running.
So how do you handle the issue of other language support? Like if people who don't speak your language email you for technical support, because that's always been my concern with localizing my stuff. Is like, well, even if I localize the whole app, I'd have to, am I also going to localize the whole website, the content I'm showing in the app, like the podcast storefronts, like all that stuff, and then also my support, which, I'm a bad example because I don't really provide support, I guess. But
sure.
But for people who are better people than me, who provide support, how do you handle that question?
Yeah, and so this is something that it was the last topic I wanted to touch on, because I feel like it's easy to think, oh, well, then I have to provide support in these languages, and I don't speak those languages. And you'll get support in the native language of your users either way. And so sometimes people who know who I am and know that I'm based in the US and, that I speak English will email me in English, even though I know they're German or they're French or they're Spanish. But generally, you'll just get emails from people who found your app on the App Store, downloaded it, and have a question, and they'll hit the contact button if they can find it. Because obviously it may, if it's email us is the button label, they may not actually know what that means, but maybe email is a fairly good term, but maybe as a side point, it's a good idea to put an icon on that button either way. But they'll get an email, and those will happen either way. And so you don't have to, I really wouldn't worry about it too much. And my experience is I take that, and this is an example where Google Translate is your friend rather than in your in-app translations. You just take, if you take what they sent you and run it through Google Translate, it's usually good enough that you can understand what the intent is, especially because customer support by its nature is somewhat repetitive. Like there tend to be certain issues that come up over and over again. And so you'll get an email and you run it through Google Translate, you'll get a sense of what they're saying. And then what I typically do is I'll respond in English, because I can't write in any other language, so that's all I can do. And then I'll take that and run my response through Google Translate into whatever language they emailed me in, and I put that underneath my English text and send it back. And in the hopes that the combination of, if they speak some English and then having the Google Translate rough translation, they'll be able to understand. And I would say by and large, that works. That people understand that I don't speak their language, that I don't get a lot of people upset about that or have issues with that. There's this natural thing that I'm an American company, I speak English, and I'm just doing the best I can. And I think I wouldn't worry about it beyond that.
think you might have converted me.
Let's see it. I look forward to launching Overcast in German and seeing all those nice big long strings.
Oh, man, I'm not looking forward to testing that. All right, thanks for listening, everybody, and we will talk to you next week.
Bye.